So far, the rook and pawn games that we've looked at have begun in a defined pawn structure. This game is different. We just made the transition into the endgame. I'm up a pawn. My opponent was a young French grandmaster named Etienne Bacrot, a very talented player. I have the black pieces, he's white. We played this game in Bermuda, 1999. As this endgame develops, I want you to notice the pawn structures, I want you to notice the structural decisions, and I want you to feel the competitive moment. Watch how I repeat the moves, how I pressure him, how I slowly increase my advantage and try to convert into the win. He began with rook c1, trading the b-pawn for my c-pawn, a good decision because he has to activate his rook. I played rook takes b2, rook takes c5. Usually a rook on the 7th rank is very, very dangerous. Bruce Pandolfini used to call a rook on the 7th a pig, because it has a way of gobbling up pawns, and it also limits the mobility of the other guy's king. A very good weapon. But now, he's threatening to play rook c7. His rook wants to go to the 7th, and I have to leave my active position to prevent his. If, for example, he would be allowed to play rook c8 check, king f7, rook c7 check, I'd lose my a-pawn, and all my advantage would go away. I have to stop that. I played rook b7. He played rook a5, king f7. Now his rook is very active. He has some compensation for the pawn. King f2, king f6, centralizing. King f3. Now I want to fix his kingside pawn structure. Create weaknesses. I played the strong move, h5. Now this is only possible because of his last move. The king being on f3, if he plays rook takes h5, then I'll immediately play rook b3 check, the king moves, and after rook takes a3, I have two passed pawns. Once again, we feel the principle of two weaknesses. Two passed pawns for him to deal with is very hard. So my h5 pawn was indirectly protected by my tactic on his a3 pawn. My next move is going to be h4. I want to tie down the weakness on g2. The one element which makes it very difficult for me to succeed in this endgame is that the two weaknesses that he really has to deal with are my e-pawn and his g2 pawn. The problem is that they're too close together. It's very difficult to convert this endgame advantage because I can't draw him away from one weakness with another one. After h5 he played king e4, and I played h4. Now this was move 30. The time control in this game was 40 moves in 2 hours, and then we get another hour for the next 20 moves. We were both in time pressure, and rushing a little bit here, so you'll notice that we started repeating moves a little bit. The rule of threefold repetition states that if any exact position arises on the chessboard 3 times, then the game is officially a draw. A lot of the time in converting an advantage, in trying to reach time control, and also trying to falsely establish a sense of security in your opponent, you'll allow the position to repeat a few times, but not 3. He played king f4, rook c7, king g4. I played rook c4 check, king f3, rook c3 check. Now he has to make a choice. If he plays king up to g4, he has to be careful of a move like g5. Very strong. He can't play rook takes g5 because of rook g3 check, winning the rook. And after rook takes a7, rook g3 check, king h5, rook takes g2. He's in big trouble. My e-pawn is passed, nothing can get in its way, and his king is paralyzed on the side of the board. Of course, he's not going to make that mistake. After rook c3, he went back king f2. I went back rook c7, defending my pawn. And after king f3, I played g5. So from those checks, I was able to establish my pawn structure. Exactly what I wanted. King e3. Rook c3 check, king f2, rook c7. This repetition of moves was only with the aim of reaching time control. Also, you should remember that there's no danger of threefold repetition once you've made a pawn move. Any pawn move starts that repetition afresh. King e3, rook b7. King f3, now I played rook b3 check. King f2, rook b7. Now we've made move 40. He played king e3, rook c7, king f3, rook b7, king e3 again, rook b3 check, king f2. Now stop. Put yourself in my position. You've been pressuring your opponent for a very, very long time. These moves took a lot of time. All of his defense has been very, very accurate. He's defending very well. I've been trying to push him back. His defense is very solid. I've seen that with my rook on the 7th rank, it's almost impossible for me to break through. Now I've played rook b3 check, king goes to f2. In order to continue, I'm going to have to sacrifice a pawn. Evaluate the move e5. What did you think? This is one of the hardest kinds of moves to make in chess. When a player has an advantage, it's very easy to fall into a state of comfort, to believe that the position is slightly better for you, and so the debate is almost whether or not you'll win or draw. This is a very dangerous psychological situation, because often you have to take calculated risks in order to convert the advantage into a win. Careful defense entices risks. My opponent's been defending very well. e5 was a hard decision to make, but it was a good one. I sacrificed my pawn. Suddenly I'm no longer up material. He has an outside pass pawn, but now my king can get into the game. Notice a big problem with the endgame before was that my king was cut off from the struggle. If I could get my king to f5 and f4, it would be very good for me. But there was no way to do this. With his king on f3, if I play e5, he can always play the move king e4. I don't have the move rook b4 check because the a-pawn covers that square, and his next move can always be rook a6 check, forcing me back. So here I took the risk, e5. Now things get very tense. We're in the 6th hour of competition. A lot of pressure. I've had a better game, a better game, a better game, and now I've sacrificed a pawn, taken a risk. This is when things get really tight. Rook takes a7, king f5. Now I'm sure you see my plan. My idea is to first drive his king back to the first rank, then push my king maybe up to e3 or g3 and start moving with my e-pawn. I can even mate him. Think, for example, if my king is on f4, if I play rook b2 check, if he goes back to g1 after king g3, he's in big trouble. But be careful. If his rook was on the f-file, rook f3 would be mate. I got to look out for his traps as well. But that's my idea, to put my king, for example, to e4, to play rook b2 to f1, then I could even play king e3, threatening mate. He's forced to go to g1. Then I can play rook b1 check, force his king to h2, then start pushing my e-pawn. This is very strong for me. He played rook f7 check, king e4, and rook g7. Rook b2 check, king g1. Black to move. What do you do? It was in this position that I threw away the win. I had played the endgame very, very well, forcing him to defend. I made him think that he might have had the draw in hand, and then I sacrificed a pawn, so he had a sense of security finally, and then he had to begin the battle anew. This is a very, very important psychological trick. By repeating the moves, you can make your opponent lose presence a little bit. Now we've reached this position. He attacked my pawn on g5. Here I lost time. I played king f4. My idea was that I'm threatening king g3, he has to check me, and then I can play the king to e3, preparing e4. This was a critical mistake because I allowed his rook to force its way behind his own passed pawn. But first, let's look at what I should have done. After rook g7, the key to winning will be to sacrifice yet another pawn. The move king d3 was terribly strong. After rook takes g5, I would play e4. Now, of course, I have the threat immediately of e3, rook b1 check, and then after king h2, e2 and e1. He has to do something about that. He would play rook d5 check. Then I have king e2. Again, threatening rook b1 check. The pawn is coming. This position is completely winning. Say he plays rook h5, goes after my other pawn. I play rook b1 check, king h2, e3. Now, if he takes my pawn, I can just move my king out of the way. He has to sacrifice his rook by playing rook h8, e2, rook e8. But then after e1, rook takes, the position is easily winning. He does have 3 pawns, but my king can easily blockade one while the rook goes after the other. For example, if he plays h4, I play king e4. And then after king h3, I can just play king f5, followed by king g6. I take his pawn with my rook, and then in this kind of position, it's very easy to win. I just pin him, for example, drive him back slowly, and then take the pawn. This should be a very easy win. So the way to win this rook and pawn endgame involved the sacrifice of 2 pawns. I had to move from being up material to down material. That's a very difficult thing to do psychologically when you're trying to convert an endgame, because you want to convert the advantage while maintaining control of the position. Sometimes this is impossible. Rook and pawn endgames sometimes require inspired decisions. Take a look at what I did instead. I played king f4. I thought this would also be winning, threatening king g3, My impression was that he would be forced to check me, and I would just gain a tempo. My king would be one square further up the board, and he'd have to go back to g7. I missed something very important. He had the move rook f3 check. And after my king moves to d4, he played the very strong rook f2, offering a trade of rooks and forcing his way behind his passed pawn. And now all the themes we've been looking at come into one. First of all, psychologically, in the moment when I was closest to the win, I made my big mistake. I relaxed a little bit. When you start to think about the result, often in competition, you lose presence. Also, we see the theme of rooks going behind the passed pawn. The point is that he wants to ideally maneuver his rook to a2. If I play rook b3, he immediately plays rook a2, defends my pawn's advance from the second rank, and begins to play a4, a5, a6. If I play rook b1 check, he plays rook f1, blocks it that way. I can't trade rooks, obviously, because he has the outside passed pawn, and he can blockade my pawn with his king, move his pawn, take my pawn, and eventually win the endgame. So I have to avoid that. I would have to now go rook b3. But then he would play rook a1, and we'd have a big problem. e4, a4, e3. The king can now come king f1. He blockades with his king and pushes his pawn. It's a draw. When he played rook f2, he offered me a draw. And I thought for some time, tried to figure out a way out of it, and I had to agree. I missed my chance. The key moment was the sacrifice of the second pawn. I let his rook get back into the defense, and there was no way to win. If you feel like it, analyze this endgame out. Make sure you understand why it's a draw.